At this point, I would like to introduce Patrick Rafferty, who's our speaker for today. For those of you that have been coming to these programs for several years, Pat did a program for us about 2 years ago, and it was very well attended, and everyone who came thoroughly enjoyed it. So by popular demand, we've invited him back. For those of you that don't know Pat, let me give you a little bit about his background, what makes him perfect for this kind of a presentation. First of all, he's a native of Westchester County. He graduated from Archbishop Stepanek High School in White Plains in 2001. He received a BA in History from Concordia College in Bronxville in 2005. And while there, he was the recipient of the Richard Heinz Memorial Prize that same year. He was selected to receive the recent Alumni Award from Concordia in 2014. In 2006, he became the library assistant at the Westchester County Historical Society and began to pursue his master's degree in library and information science from the Palmer School at Long Island University. Upon receiving his master's in 2007, he was promoted to assistant librarian at the County Historical Society. While serving as assistant librarian, he wrote 4 articles for the Westchester County Historical Society's quarterly journal called the Westchester Historian. In the meantime, he also has been employed as an interpreter at Sunnyside, the home of Washington Irving and Tarrytown from 2005 to 2007. In March 2011, he became the head librarian of the Westchester County Historical Society. And 3 months later, the Society published his first book, The Cemeteries of Westchester County, a 3-volume work with over 1,000 photos that provides information on each of Westchester's burial places. His second book was also published by the Society, called The Cemeteries of the Bronx in 2016. Since 2009, he's been a tour guide at the Cathedral of St. John Divine in Manhattan, and from 2012 to 2016, he was the president of the Mount Pleasant Historical Society. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Patrick Rafferty. Yeah. I think that'll make the photos that much clearer.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me today. This presentation is going to consist solely of postcards, and it's going to give us sort of we're going to take kind of a historical tour from the county's history from the late 1600s up until about the 1990s or so. I think I'll be happy to take any questions at the end, but if you want to ooh and all over the postcards, if you have some urgent comment or something like that, and you really want to raise your hand or make a remark, I guess you can feel free to do so, okay? So before we start, does anyone recognize this restaurant here?
Yeah.
Sure, Bill Reavers.
Bill Reavers. So this was located in Elmsford. If you don't recognize it, you might remember there was a catering facility called Anton's.
Yes.
So Bill Reavers later became Anton's, and it was demolished a couple of years ago and some apartments stand there. So we're going to roll all the way back to the 1600s. Might have some problems. Most of the postcards that you see were created in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, but a lot of them came later on. So when you see the depictions, that's when they were made, about 1900 to 1920 or so. That was the golden age of postcards. So this is the Knapp House in what is now the city of Rye. There are 2 houses from the 1600s still standing in Westchester County from the 1600s, and the Knapp House is one of them. It is presently owned by the Rye Historical Society, and it serves as their archives and reading room. It is on Milton Road just south of Playland Parkway. The other surviving house from the 1600s is Phillips Manor Hall, which is located in the city of Yonkers. Phillips Manor Hall was the seat of Phillipsburg Manor. If we were on this spot in colonial times, we would be in Phillipsburg Manor. Phillipsburg Manor included all of what is now Yonkers, the town of Greenburgh, the town of Mount Pleasant, the town of Ossining, and a little piece of the Bronx as well. So they were pretty wealthy landowners. Phillipsburg Manor was confiscated, as you might know, by New York State after the Revolutionary War because the Phillips family were loyalists, and it was partitioned and sold off. So this is sort of a artist's conception of what Phillips Manor Hall would have looked like in colonial times. And this is what it would have looked like in the very early days of the 20th century, the early 1900s. You see it's all lit up at night. And at this time it was serving as Yonkers City Hall. So for a time it was owned by the village of Yonkers, and then when Yonkers became a city, it became City Hall. To the left of it, it's a little hard to see, but there's a monument sort of silhouetted against the background. That's the Yonkers Civil War Memorial. So we're going to see that later in another postcard. The people of Yonkers were very proud of Phillips Manor Hall. And in 1909, there was the 300th anniversary of Henry Hudson sailing up the river for the first time, as well as the 100th anniversary of Robert Fulton's invention of the steamboat. So there were all these celebrations that took place in 1609, and Yonkers decided to make a float that looked like Phillips Manor Hall. So for all the parades and things like that, this was how Yonkers was represented, by moving Phillips Manor Hall. There is one interesting structure from the 1600s that still sort of stands in Mamaroneck. The reason I say sort of stands is there was a house that belonged to the Disbrow family that was built in the late 1600s. By the beginning of the 20th century, it had either fallen apart, collapsed, or been destroyed by fire. But this chimney was left from it. And the chimney was located right next to Route 1, Boston Post Road in Mamaroneck. And so it kind of became a popular landmark. People were going up and down Route 1 and they passed this funny chimney. So a bunch of postcards were made of it. If you're familiar, there was a restaurant in Mamaroneck called Washington Arms.
Yes.
If you go to that building, it's not Washington Arms anymore. If you go to that building now, there's an old chimney attached to it. And that is the reconstructed version of this chimney. And it's usually called the Disbrow chimney. Another structure from colonial times is the Old Dutch Church of Sleepy Hollow. And of course, this painting or this illustration is not from the 1700s. It's sort of an artist's conception of what it would look like when people were going to church on Sunday. And of course, it became a popular tourist spot. Even though it was an active church, it's owned by the Reformed Church of the Tarrytowns. Many people like to visit it, go inside the inside, and see that it hadn't changed much since colonial times. And if you've been there during the winter, you know it's heated by a wood-burning stove. It's still a popular image to be depicted on postcards, and you can date this postcard because it calls it North Tarrytown. So you know in the mid-90s, North Tarrytown was changed to Sleepy Hollow. So this is one of the more recent postcards that we have in our collection. Another colonial house of worship is the old Friends Meeting House, or the Quaker Meeting House in Chappaqua, which is still active today and has an active congregation. This church is no longer active, but it still stands. This is St. Paul's Episcopal Church in what is now the city of Mount Vernon. It is the only National Park Service site in Westchester County. Raise your hand if you've been here. If you haven't been here, this is a really interesting place to check out. The church itself that you see there was begun in the 1760s. During the Revolutionary War, it was used as a hospital after the Battle of Pell's Point. But there was a congregation worshiping on this site going back to the late 1600s. And so you can check out the interesting church as well as the cemetery around it. Of course, the Revolution was a big event here in Westchester County. And one of the major events was the capture of Major John Andre in September of 1780. Major Andre was, sort of like the liaison between the British Army and Benedict Arnold. At the time, Benedict Arnold was going to give the plans to West Point over to the British. And when he was coming down Route 9 in what is now Tarrytown, about where the border is of Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow, he was stopped by 3 militiamen, and they made him take off his boots. So if you look at the second man from the left, you see his boots are right next to his feet. And in his boots, they found the plans to West Point. And this is what revealed that Benedict Arnold was a traitor. And Major Andre was hanged a few weeks later over in Tappan, New Jersey. On the left, that's where the capture took place, in what's now Patriots Park. And on the right, that is a sort of night view of the same location. I don't know if everyone's familiar with the fact that we used to have 2 county seats in Westchester County. Of course, we know White Plains today is the county seat, but for many years, Bedford and White Plains were our co-county seats. Westchester was much bigger in the past because it included all of what is now Bronx County. And so there needed to be these 2 different places for people to go to. And the courthouse in Bedford, there was also a courthouse in White Plains, but the courthouse in Bedford was built in 1787, and it's actually still there today. It's no longer used for court purposes, but it is owned by the Bedford Historical Society, and they've restored it to what it would have looked like in the late 1700s. So an interesting spot to visit. Bedford Historical Society also owns a 1-room schoolhouse on the Bedford Village Green, and it gives kids a chance to see what school would have been like for them 200 years ago. There are a few other 1-room schoolhouses scattered around the county. One of them is the Marble Schoolhouse in Eastchester. There's also a little schoolhouse on Route 1 in Mamaroneck. So there's still a couple of these schoolhouses that are around, and they're not used anymore, but they've been restored to what they would have looked like, mostly during the, I would say, 19th century. The last 1-room schoolhouse in Westchester did not close until the 1960s, and that was the East Middle Patton Schoolhouse up in North Castle. And that is now owned by the North Castle Historical Society. I think this is sort of interesting because it's a shot of Mount Kisco, and at the bottom it says bird's eye view. So of course there were no drones, no airplanes, no helicopters to take these aerial photos from. And so someone would go up on a hill and take the image like that. So that was the best you were going to get if you wanted a sort of widespread shot of a particular place. The railroads first came into Westchester County in the 1840s, and stations were built along the valleys. So, for example, the Bronx River Valley is where the Harlem Line was. The Hudson Line goes along the Hudson River. And this really allowed for Westchester to get away from being a sort of agricultural center. People could commute, live in Westchester, and work in New York City. And so this here is the Chappaqua train station. And the building itself looks a lot then like it does today, but instead of pulling up in horses and buggies, people are now being dropped off in taxis and cars. But a couple of railroads that were built no longer exist. One of them was in New York, Westchester, and Boston. And part of it still exists in the Bronx as the Dyer Avenue line, the subway line. But it used to continue through Westchester. One branch of it went along what is now the New Haven line in Metro North. The other one, though, went up into White Plains, and it ended at this big fancy station located where the Westchester Mall is now. And the railroad went bankrupt, I believe, in the 1930s and was eventually removed. But stretches of it can still be detected, and a couple of the stations still stand. So at the Five Corners area in Scarsdale, there's a little real estate office. That was the Heathcote station. So a couple of stations still exist there. A number of our older government buildings no longer stand. Does anyone recognize this building?
Yeah.
The old courthouse.
So this is the old Westchester County Courthouse on Main Street in White Plains. Once the court moved out of this building to the present big high-rise that we know today, there was a movement to try to save this structure. This is about the time of the bicentennial, so this is when people were becoming interested in local history. Unfortunately, though, the effort was not successful and the courthouse was demolished, so it no longer stands today. And its space is now occupied by the area of the Gallery and On the back side of the courthouse, on Martine Avenue, which is the street at the bottom there, is where the Supreme Court building was, so the New York State Court at right. And on the left was the county jail. So you see those narrow, long windows so that the prisoners couldn't get out. So this would be right across the street from the county office building, the county office. Hospitals came into existence in Westchester in the late 1800s. At this time, remember, there was not the public investment in healthcare that there is today. And so it really reflected well on the residents of a particular community if they had a hospital, because that meant that they were being charitable and funding these hospitals. So this is Mount Vernon Hospital in the back in Roosevelt Square. And in front is the Mount Vernon Civil War Soldiers Memorial. Two other Civil War Soldiers Memorials are located in White Plains on the right. You've probably seen that before if you were on Broadway. On the left, that is the Yonkers Civil War Memorial that we talked about before on the grounds of Phillips Manor Hall. And it's really interesting because if you look at the bottom, there are figures around the base, and they represent different branches of the Army and as well as the Navy. So these interesting figures that were placed on the memorial. Originally, the fire departments in Westchester County were entirely volunteer, and some of them are still entirely volunteer today. This is the Columbia Hook and Ladder Company No. 2 in Mount Vernon. And again, there was not the money given to fire departments to hire paid men. And so you relied on the volunteerism and the members of your community being willing to give their time and their effort to these public safety companies. This isn't a historic postcard, but I think it's an interesting shot nonetheless. These are members of the White Plains Fire Department training. And if you look at bottom center, they're the guys standing around, they're holding like a net. And if you go straight up above them, you see the man jumping off. You see him there?
Yeah.
So he's jumping, and you can see him, and you can see his shadow. And so they're practicing catching people jumping out of buildings. And they have a crowd of interested boys on the right watching. This was put, a number of historical societies, not so much recently, but really in the 80s and 90s, would publish their own postcards using historic photographs. So like I said, this is not something that would have been in a postcard in the early 20th century. Well, recently, this is the kind of thing that people or societies would publish maybe as fundraisers. We actually in Westchester have a connection to the founding of the New York State Police. In about the time of World War I, there was an assault on a man that took place in the town of Bedford. The man eventually died from his injuries. He was able to identify his assailants, but because there wasn't a real police department in Bedford, it was too late for the authorities to capture the assailant. And so a wealthy woman in the area sort of began to put together a movement to have a state police force that could cover these rural areas. And there's actually a little state historic marker up in Bedford that indicates where this murder took place. You might remember this building. It's up off of the Sprain Parkway near where the old Hawthorne Circle used to be.
Right.
It's no longer used as a state police barracks. It is now condominiums, but there still is a state police building next door to it. We also had two military installations in Westchester County. One was Fort Slocum, located on David's Island in New Rochelle. It was rented by the federal government during the Civil War as a hospital, and then later David's Island was purchased by the federal government, and Fort Slocum was established there. It closed, I believe, in the late 60s, and you probably remember there was a long ongoing fight about what to do with David's Island. Eventually all the buildings were demolished, and it's just kind of sitting there without any use today. But Camp Smith is still being used. It was originally founded in the late 1800s as Camp Townsend, and it was later renamed for Governor Al Smith. And it is a New York State National Guard facility. I mentioned before how we're connected to the city through commuters, people who live up here and work in this city. But we're also connected through the city's need for water. As the city grew and grew in Manhattan and started moving further and further north along the island, they needed more and more sources of water. And so to do that, the city began in the late 1830s to acquire land by eminent domain to establish the original Croton Dam in what is now Yorktown and the original Croton Reservoir. But as the city kept growing and growing and growing and then moved over into what is now the Bronx, they needed more reservoirs. And so again, they went to eminent domain and acquired more land in the Croton River Valley. And they began construction on the present Croton Dam. And so you see work going on there. My guess is this would be about 1905 or so, this image. So work kept going on. So you look, they're sort of finishing up the job there. There's still some construction going on. And that's the finished product. Street scenes were favorite views of these postcard companies. And it's interesting to look at them because you can see how these communities have changed over the years. This is Main Street, Mount Kisco. Of course, it looks a lot different today, but the Methodist church that you see on the left used to be Methodist Episcopal Church, now it's a United Methodist Church. That church is still there, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places. Another good Main Street view of Mount Kisco, definitely something that you're not going to see anymore. Horses with hay coming down the main road. Another scene you're not going to see anymore. I do this with Perk, everyone else. Now, my belief is from the, has anyone seen this postcard before? We're looking west towards Dobbs Ferry. On the right, it's hard to see, but there's sort of a rose-colored building. And if you look at the absolute right, up at the top, do you see the bell? There's a firehouse. And the river, I think, I was looking at an old map this morning to absolutely sort of pinpoint it. The river is running between the fence on the right and the firehouse. And it's going underneath the road here, and you see the gap between the two buildings? That's where the river is going through. So those people there on their horses, they're actually sort of on a bridge. Is everyone familiar with Horace Greeley? He was the publisher of the New York Tribune. He ran for president in 1872. He had a very large presence in Chappaqua. And after he died, the Chappaqua property went to his daughter, Gabrielle. And she married an Episcopal priest named Frank Clendenin. And they built a chapel on their property. And that's where they chose to be buried, and they also buried their children as well. And so this was originally a private church, but when Mr. Reverend Clendenin passed away, he bequeathed it to the Episcopal Diocese of New York, and it is now an open Episcopal parish called St. Mary the Virgin. Do you recognize this church at all in Irvington? So this was originally the Irvington Presbyterian Church, and when they built their current church across Broadway, they sold it to a growing congregation of Roman Catholics, and it became the Church of the Immaculate Conception. So when you're on Route 9 and you're driving north, on the left is the Presbyterian Church, on the right is the Catholic Church. Up the hill behind the Catholic Church is sort of a playground on a rise. That's where this church was. It had a fire in the 1970s, and it sort of sat vacant and empty for about 20 years. It was finally demolished in the early 1990s. Another church is Christ Episcopal in Tarrytown, and it was where Washington Irving was a vestryman. It's also where his funeral was held. On the right is a fountain that was in the middle of Mount Kisco, sort of like we saw that fountain in the middle of Ardsley. And on the top of it is a statue of a Native American called Chief Kisco. There never was a Chief Kisco. He's a totally fictional character. His statue is still there, but it's not in the middle of the road anymore. Another sort of interesting, I can't call it a statue, depiction of a famous person is this rock here in Mamaroneck. It is called the Rock Face of Washington. And it's located right next to where the Washington Arms was. Maybe that's how they got the name Washington Arms. I've been there because for many years it was overgrown. I think the owners didn't like people coming by and looking at the face. But recently they've cleared it out. I've been there, and I have to say it actually does look like his head.
Like
No, it was, I think it was chiseled a bit to look like that. Recreation was a big deal in Westchester County, and one of the most popular spots was Glen Island. Glen Island originally opened in the late 1800s as a private amusement park. It was sort of like, almost like the Disneyland of Westchester County. It closed right before World War I though, and in the 1920s, Westchester County purchased it and filled it in. So if you go to the Glen Island now, it's just one island, but it's been filled in to look like that. So those flat places, particularly where the parking lots are, that's all landfill. And they built the Glen Island Casino, which was a very popular place in the big band era. A number of people such as Benny Goodman and Tommy Dorsey played there. Libraries and institutions, public libraries, sort of like the one we're in now, became very important in Westchester around the turn of the 20th century. Did anyone ever go into this library in Yonkers?
Oh, yeah.
So this was located right next to City Hall, and it looks like there's a little tower at sort of the right side of it. That's actually City Hall, the tower of City Hall, so that's not part of the library itself. This was a Carnegie library, so it was one of the ones that was funded in part by Andrew Carnegie. In the 1970s, when Yonkers was widening some of its roads to provide better transportation throughout the city, this was slated for demolition. Again, there was an effort to save it. It didn't go through. And today, Nebrahan Avenue goes right through where the library was located. The present library is in the old Otis Elevator Company building, and it's pretty impressive in its own right.
Hat Goodbye Columbus was filmed there.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
because he played the part of a librarian.
Ah, okay. This is the one building that people always really lament when I give these talks. They lament that it's not standing anymore, is this one. People are very fond of it. The Kensico Dam was completed about the time of World War I, and not long after the Bronx River Parkway was built. And people often make the joke, why do you drive in a parkway and park in a driveway? I can't say why you park in a driveway, but you drive in a parkway because it really was supposed to be a park. It's really called the Bronx River Parkway Reservation. And it was intended to sort of be a nice Sunday drive, not necessarily a road that you would use to get to work. You can see in the middle, or towards the right, there's no median. So those cars are all going back and forth with no median in between. We like to say in another presentation that it was designed for pleasure driving at moderate speeds. So there's still pleasure driving going on, but not at moderate speeds.
Well, wasn't the speed limit like 20 miles an hour?
I think so, yeah. I don't think they could go much faster than that. Connected to the Bronx River Parkway was the establishment of the Westchester County Center as a public space, public sort of meeting space, convention space. One thing I'd like to point out, and especially because we're in the town of Greenburgh right now, the words on both sides that are sort of blurred, those are the municipalities in the county, the cities and the towns.
Right.
Does anyone know the problem with Greenburgh?
It's misspelled.
Misspelled, very good. I know I'm with the Greenburgh audience. So it's spelled without an H at the end. Grenburg. And no one has fixed it. Because of the urban renewal that took place in the late 20th century, a lot of these street views in White Plains look very different. So we are looking on Main Street, which used to be called Railroad Avenue. To the left, where these guys are standing leaning against the wall, that's the corner of the courthouse property. So we are looking west towards the train station in Chatterton Hill. You can see the trolley tracks in the middle of the road. So the road is quite a bit wider now than it appears in this image. There's also, this is a similar view of kind of like a nighttime street view. If you go back, the previous one, you see this building here. That's the same building there on the right. Again, recreation, the Empire City Racetrack in Yonkers has, I think it's over 100 years old now, that some sort of gambling activity has been taking spot at that location. Another recreation spot was the Getty Farms Hotel in White Plains. It was opened in the early 20th century. It was a very popular recreation facility. It was located just south of the Burke Rehabilitation Center, but it had a big fire in the 1920s and was not rebuilt. But it had golf courses connected to it, and so there was Ridgeway Country Club there and Westchester Hills, so it was a recreation area, not just to sort of go to a relaxing hotel, but also to play golf. And in terms of public parks, what we looked at before in terms of recreation, like the Getty Farms Hotel, that was a private place. Not everyone could just go there. So that's why the establishment of public parks like Hudson Park and New Rochelle were so important. Before Hudson Park was established, there was no real public access to the Long Island Sound. So New Rochelle had this great waterfront, but people couldn't get to it. And so when Hudson Park was established, that really opened it up and provided access for people to go to the shore. But there's still areas near it that are not accessible to the public, like Premium Point. It's kind of gated and there's security guards. Another form of recreation was the Hudson River Day Line. Did anyone ever go on a boat like this?
Yeah.
So you could be picked up along the Hudson River, and the boat would take you north up to a special private park in the town of Cortland. And when everything closed, that special private park became the site of the Indian Point nuclear facility. So it was called Indian Point Park when it was this private day line park. You recognize this at all? It looks a lot different, but if you read the bottom, you'll know where it is.
Woodlands.
Woodlands Lake, right? So the vantage point that this image is looking from is where the old putt would have been. So you could take the train up, hop off at the Woodland station, walk across the dam, which is kind of to the left, and there was a hotel right on the other side. There's also a couple of buildings back there as well. Of course, when the Springbrook Parkway came through, that changed the character of this area, and those buildings were removed.
Throughway.
What did I say?
Sprain, you said.
Sprain, okay.
Sawmill.
Thank you for the correction. And again, hospitals. Has anyone ever had, for either good reasons or bad reasons, had to go to Northern Westchester Hospital up in Mount Kisco?
Yeah.
This is what it started as.
Wow.
This was just a house. And again, it started in 1916. It was a private charity, and it grew and grew and grew and got to the big hospital that we know today. Another medical facility was the Bloomingdale Asylum in White Plains. And a lot of the charitable institutions that we see in these postcards are not things that we would think of nowadays to put on postcards. But you have to remember, because these were privately funded, that reflected well on the people, that they were willing to give their money, their time, and their efforts to these various charities. Same thing with, this is now Graham Wyndham in Hastings-on-Hudson. So it reflected well on the population that they were willing to support these charitable institutions. The Chappaqua Mountain Institute was originally located in Chappaqua, then it moved to Valhalla, but it kept its name when it moved to Valhalla. So it was called the Chappaqua Mountain Institute in Valhalla, and that has confused every single researcher that has ever contacted our library. This was located on a big hill sort of southwest of the Kensico Dam, so it had a nice river valley view. And the way it worked was during the year, the school year, it was a school, and during the summer, it was a hotel. This he says they're homeschool for girls in the real country. Another school in Westchester is Westchester Community College. And this is a postcard that was produced not long after it moved to Valhalla. It started out in the lower level of the school on Battle Hill. and then it eventually moved over into, well, it has a Valhalla address, it's really in Greenberg. The estate, and that's the main estate house that I believe is now used as the administration building. One thing I mentioned though about postcards, don't believe everything that they say.
Right.
This is an old Huguenot house in New Rochelle. It was located on North Avenue, just south of Iona College. And it's labeled Washington headquarters. This house was never Washington headquarters. But on occasion, I guess to sort of bring attention to particular communities, certain things were put on these postcards that weren't true. Another good example of a incorrect description is about this building. This used to be on the Rockefeller Estate, Kycut, and Pecanigo Hills. And it says Rookery. This old house is supposed to have been built about the year 1750. Major Andre lodged here the night before his capture. That is absolutely untrue and incorrect. But it's a nice story. So we're sort of moving away from the kind of golden age of postcards. Postcards are still out there by this time period, like the 1950s or so, but they're kind of being used more as advertisements. And this is something that almost everyone recognizes when I bring it up. Patricia Murphy's restaurant. It was just northwest of Central Avenue and Tuckahoe Road. And a lot of people have great memories of going there, as well as to the one in Florida, Fort Lauderdale as well.
I know that.
Yep, that's downtown Scarsdale. So postcards are still being made as we're getting into the late 20th century. Not as popular as they used to be. There are different forms of communication. There's the telephone. Now there's email. So as a communication means, postcards are kind of going by the wayside at this point. But there's still a few that were made, including this one here of Scarsdale. Another relatively recent view of Mamaroneck Avenue in White Plains. The big building on the right, the National Bank of Westchester, is now Arts Westchester. And you can see Macy's in the back where City Center is.
Where Macy's used to be.
A number of museums opened up around Westchester in the mid to late 20th century, and they would produce their own postcards. So, does anyone recognize this particular room? This is Washington Irving's study at Sunnyside. And we know with a pretty good degree of certainty that this is what it looked like during his lifetime, because a couple of his visitors made sketches of it, and a few of them also provided these sort of written descriptions of it. So that is his study, and in the back, you see there's a little sofa, and if he was tired of writing, he could lay down there, close the curtains, and take a nap. And we'll finish off with this postcard here of Dobbs Ferry. By this time, of course, there are airplanes and helicopters that you can take pictures from. So this is more of an appropriate bird's eye view than the one we saw before of Mount Kisco. This is where Cedar Street, or Main Street, and Broadway split at the bottom. With another image of George Washington's head, we'll conclude. And if there are, that's route, the road that you see at all far right, that's Route 1, that's the Boston Post Road. If there are any questions, comments, criticisms,
Anybody have any questions? Garrett?
You didn't mention any cemeteries for those parts, you would. Could you, with your knowledge and background on these cemeteries in the Bronx and Westchester, could you compare and contrast from a sort of a maybe demographic or sociological view, Woodlawn versus Sleepy Hollow Cemetery?
Sleepy Hollow is a bit older than Woodlawn. Sleepy Hollow was opened up in the late 1840s, and it was really one of the first rural cemeteries in the county. Woodlawn was opened up in 1864-65. They were a bit different in that Sleepy Hollow, I've gotten the impression, was intended primarily as a sort of area cemetery. Mostly local families buried there of various means. There are some plots that are not particularly expensive and some that are very expensive. When Woodlawn was opened up, it was still, the Bronx was still part of Westchester, so it was a Westchester cemetery. but it was really targeted towards Manhattanites because of the railroad. Same thing with Kensico Cemetery. Kensico even had its own train car that you could rent from Grand Central Station, come up the train tracks, and have your funeral party, detrain at their own train station and be buried from there. So originally, a lot of those rural cemeteries, like the one in White Plains, they were really for the area. But as sort of like how the city needed more reservoir space, they needed more cemetery space as well. And so these bigger cemeteries began to target city dwellers as well as Westchesters. But because they were targeting city dwellers, that's why you see in a place like Woodlawn these gigantic mausoleums and burial plots, because they had the money to do that. Yes?
I'm just curious where you got the slides from.
Oh, I should have said that in the beginning.
Do you have postcards? Or
Yes.
Do you have, okay.
We have a collection of about 2,500 postcards that belong to us, and then an additional 600 or so that belong to other historical societies but are on long-term loan with us. And these can pretty much all be searched through a database that's can be accessed through our website, which is westchesterhistory.com. So these have all been scanned, digitized, and uploaded to our database. Yes?
Not sure if you can answer this, but with old postcards that have been tinted to be colored, do you know if the community would have provided any kind of historical, any kind of record as to what the buildings are actually colored? Or if it was just up to the tinter, you know?
That's an interesting question, and unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. I would say not just the coloring of these color postcards, the information. Where I wonder, like I talked about the two that had the incorrect information. Where do they get that information from?
Because of the building in Ardsley that you pointed out with the fire tower, it's pink, has sort of a pinkish.
I was gonna say the same thing. I've seen that picture in black and white, so who said the building was pink?
Right.
Yeah.
I was just kind of curious.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't quite know the answer to it. Yes?
What was the first library in Ardsley?
Where was the first library in Ardsley?
It was in the
Chico's.
Village Hall.
Correct.
First library in 1923.
Wow.
It was established on the second floor of the old municipal building. The building was torn down and make way for the fire station.
Thank you for bailing me out there, Walter.
Pat, I have a question for you,
Sure.
Richard. So many of these postcards that I've seen have a message on the back. Just arrived.
Yes.
Weather is wonderful. How's the baby? I mean, is that accurate, or is that just tossed in for fun or whatever?
I've never really come across any postcards in our collection that have any really fascinating information on the back, like some in-depth discussion of the place where they visited. They got here, weather's good. Like you said, got here, baby is fine. Like there's not much that's really in-depth.
So do we know that was really put on the postcard at the time it was sent, or just by someone trying to sell it?
I don't know.
I don't know either.
I don't know. That's possible. Anyone else?
All right, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Pat. We do now have some refreshments.
Mr. Pellegrino has a question.
Right.
Actually, not on the topic. Pat, could you tell us what's upcoming in the county historian? You mentioned
what's
to me at the
upcoming in county
beginning.
historian?
I thought you could tease that a little, and it
guess
might
I
not be the
should.
next program, but it might encourage people to buy the issue.
Sure.
Please share it.
So we publish a quarterly journal called the Westchester Historian. It's seasonally, winter, fall, spring, and summer. The next one that comes out will be in the summer, and it'll have 2 articles, but one of them I've written. And it's about a bunch of people in the city of Yonkers that had connections to the RMS Titanic. There was an immigrant couple from England that was living in Yonkers. They went back to England, and then they were coming back to America. They were aboard the Titanic. They drowned with the ship. They were, as far as I can tell, they were the only couple who died in the sinking for whom both their bodies were recovered. And they were buried down the block at Oakland Cemetery in Yonkers. But there were also a couple of people who were coming to Yonkers that did survive, including one crew member who stayed overnight at a house in Yonkers and said some things about the sinking that he later, I think he was just kind of embellishing things, he later kind of took back. So some interesting stuff with that. But it comes out quarterly. If you're interested in joining our society, you can join through westchesterhistory.com, and there's a membership. And one of the most recent authors of an article for the Quarterly Journal is Walter. And Walter, on Saturday at the Dobbs Ferry Public Library, you are giving a talk about Franklin Quimby Brown, who was sort of the leading citizen of Dobbs Ferry in the early 20th century. And what time is that?
2:30.
2:30. So I had to put a plug for that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. For those of you who